Level 4. My avatar's eyes slid open, and I was back in my world history classroom. The seats around me were now filled with other students, and our teacher, Mr. Avinovich, was materializing at the front of the classroom. Mr. A's avatar looked like a portly, bearded college professor. He sported a infectious grin, white wire-rimmed spectacles, and a tweedy jacket with patches on the elbows. When he spoke, he somehow always managed to sound like he was reading a passage from Dickens. I liked him. He was a good teacher. Of course, we didn't know who Mr. Avinovich really was or where he lived. We didn't know his real name, or even if he was really a man. For all we knew, he could have been a small Inuit woman living in Anchorage, Alaska, who adopted his appearance and voice to make her students be more receptive to her lessons. But for some reason, I suspected that Mr. Avinovich's avatar looked and sounded just like the person operating it. All of my teachers were pretty great. Unlike their real-world counterparts, most of the Oasis public school teachers seemed to genuinely enjoy their job, probably because they didn't have to spend half their time acting as babysitters and disciplinarians. The Oasis software took care of that, ensuring that students remained quiet and in their seats. All the teachers had to do was teach. It was also a lot easier for online teachers to hold their students' attention because here in the Oasis, the classrooms were like holodecks. Teachers could take their students on a virtual field trip every day without ever leaving the school grounds. During our world history lesson that morning, Mr. Avinovich loaded a standalone simulation so that our class could witness the discovery of King Tut's tomb by archaeologists in Egypt in 1922. The day before, we'd visited the same spot in 1334 BC and had seen Tutankhamun's empire in all its glory. In my next class, biology, we traveled through a human heart and watched it pumping from the inside, just like that old movie Fantastic Voyage. In our class, we toured the Louvre, while all of our avatars wore silly berets. In my astronomy class, we visited each of Jupiter's moons. We stood on the volcanic surface of Io while our teacher explained how the moon had originally formed. As our teacher spoke to us, Jupiter loomed behind her, filling half the sky, its great red spot churning slowly just over her left shoulder. Then she snapped her fingers and we were standing on Europa, discussing the possibility of extraterrestrial life beneath the moon's icy crust. I spent my lunch period sitting in one of the green fields bordering the school, staring at the simulated scenery while I munched on a protein bar with my visor on. It beat staring at the inside of my hideout. I was a senior, so I was allowed to go off-world during lunch if I wanted to, but I didn't have that kind of spare dough to blow. Logging into the Oasis was free, but traveling around inside it wasn't. Most of the time, I didn't have enough credits to teleport off-world and get back to Ludus. When the last bell rang each day, the students who had things to do in the real world would log out of the Oasis and vanish. Everyone else would head off-world. A lot of kids own their own interplanetary vehicles. School parking lots all over Ludus were filled with UFOs, TIE fighters, and old NASA space shuttles. Vipers from Battlestar Galactica and other spacecraft designs lifted from every sci-fi movie and TV show you can think of. Every afternoon, I would stand on the school's front lawn and watch with envy as these ships filled the sky, zooming off to explore the simulation's endless possibilities. The kids who didn't own ships would either hitch a ride with a friend or stampede to the nearest transport terminal, headed for some off-road dance club, gaming arena, or rock concert. But not me. I wasn't going anywhere. I was stranded on Ludus, the most boring planet in the entire Oasis. The ontologically anthropocentric sensory immersive simulation was a big place. That's the Oasis. Okay. The ontologically anthropocentric sensory immersive simulation was a big place. That's a lot. When the Oasis had first been launched, it contained only a few hundred planets for users to explore. all created by GSS programmers and artists. Their environments ran the gamut, from sword and sorcery settings to cyberpunk-themed planet-wide cities to irradiated post-apocalyptic zombie-infested wastelands. Some planets were designed with painstaking detail, others were randomly generated from a series of templates. Each one was populated with a variety of artificially intelligent NPCs, non-player characters, computer-controlled humans, animals, monsters, aliens, and androids with which Oasis users could interact. GSS had also licensed pre-existing virtual worlds from their competitors, so content that had already been created for games like EverQuest and World of Warcraft was ported over to the Oasis, and copies of Norath and Azeroth were added to the growing catalog of Oasis planets. Other virtual worlds soon followed suit, from the metaverse to the Matrix. The Firefly universe was anchored in a sector adjacent to the Star Wars galaxy, with a detailed recreation of the Star Trek universe in the sector adjacent to that. Users can now teleport back and forth between their favorite fictional worlds: Middle-earth, Vulcan, Pern, Arrakis, Magarathea, Disc-world, Mid-world, River-world, Ring-world, worlds upon worlds. For the sake of zoning and navigation, the Oasis had been divided equally into 27 cube-shaped sectors, each containing hundreds of different planets. The three-dimensional map of all 27 sectors distinctly resembled an 80s puzzle toy called a Rubik's Cube. Like most Gunters, I knew this was no coincidence. Each sector measured exactly 10 light hours across, or about 10.8 billion kilometers. So if you were traveling at the speed of light, the fastest speed attainable by any spacecraft inside the Oasis, you can get from one side of a sector to the other in exactly 10 hours. That sort of long-distance travel wasn't cheap. Spacecraft that could travel at light speed were rare, and they required fuel to operate. Charging people for virtual fuel to power their virtual spaceships was one of the ways gregarious simulation systems generated revenue, since accessing the Oasis was free. But GSS's primary source of income came from the teleportation fares. Teleportation was the fastest way to travel, but it was also the most expensive. Traveling around inside the Oasis wasn't just costly, it was also dangerous. Each sector was divided up into many different zones that varied in size and shape. Some zones were so large that they encompassed several planets, whilst others covered only a few kilometers on the surface of a single world. Each zone had a unique combination of rules and parameters. Magic would function in some zones and not in others. The same was true of technology. If you flew your technology-based starship into a zone where technology didn't function, your engines would fail in the moment you crossed that zone border. Then you'd have to hire some silly gray-bearded sorcerer with a spell-powered space barge to tow your ass back to a technology zone. Dual zones permitted the use of both magic and technology, and null zones didn't allow either. There were pacifist zones where no player versus player combat was allowed, and player versus player zones where every avatar for themselves. You had to be careful whenever you entered a new zone or sector. You had to be prepared. But like I said, I didn't have that problem. I was stuck at school. Ludus had been designed as a place of learning, so the planet had been created without a single quest portal or gaming zone anywhere on its surface. The only thing to be found here were thousands of identical school campuses separated by rolling green fields, perfectly landscaped parks, rivers, meadows, and sprawling template-generated forests. There were no castles, dungeons, or orbiting space fortresses for my avatar to raid, and there were no NPC villains, monsters, or aliens for me to fight. So there was no treasure or magic items for me to plunder. This totally sucked for a lot of reasons. Completing quests, fighting NPCs, and gathering treasure were the only ways a low-level avatar like mine would earn experience points. Earning XPs was how you increase your avatar's power level, strength, and abilities. A lot of Oasis users didn't care about their avatar's power level or bother with the gaming aspects of the simulation at all. They only used the Oasis for entertainment, business, shopping, and hanging out with their friends. These users simply avoided entering any gaming or PvP zones where their defenseless first level avatars would be attacked by NPCs or by other players. If you stayed in safe zones like Ludus, you didn't have to worry about your avatar getting robbed, kidnapped, or killed. I hated being stuck in a safe zone. If I was going to find Holiday's egg, I knew I would eventually have to venture out in the dangerous sectors of the oasis, and if I wasn't powerful or well armed enough to defend myself, I wasn't going to stay alive for very long. Over the past 5 years, I'd managed to gradually raise my avatar up to 3rd level. This hadn't been easy. I had done it by hitching rides off-world with other students, mostly H, who happened to be headed to a planet where my Wisp avatar could survive. I'd have them drop me near a newbie level gaming zone and spend the rest of the night or weekend slaying orcs, kobolds, or some other piddly ass class of monster that was too weak to kill me. For each NPC my avatar defeated, I would earn a few meager experience points and usually a handful of copper or silver coins dropped by my slain foes. These coins were instantly converted to credits, which I used to pay the teleportation fare back to Ludus, often just before the final school bell rang. Sometimes, but not often, one of the NPCs I killed would drop an item. That was how I had obtained my avatar's sword, shield, and armor. I stopped hitching rides with H at the end of the previous school year. His avatar was now above 13th level, so he was almost always headed to a planet where it wasn't safe for my avatar. He was happy to drop me on some new world along the way, but if I didn't earn enough credits to pay for my fare back to Ludus, I'd wind up missing school because I was stuck on some other planet. This was not an acceptable excuse. I now racked up so many unexcused absences that I was in danger of being expelled. If that happened, I would have to return to my school-issued Oasis console and visor. Worse, I'd be transferred back to school in the real world to finish out my senior year there. I couldn't risk that. So these days, I rarely left Ludus at all. I was stuck here, and stuck at 3rd level. Having a 3rd level avatar was a colossal embarrassment. None of the other Gunters took you seriously unless you were at least 10th level. Even though I had been a Gunter since day one, everyone still considered me a noob. It was beyond frustrating. In desperation, I tried to find a part-time job after school, just to earn some walking around money. I applied for dozens of tech support and programming jobs, mostly grunt construction work, coding parts of Oasis malls and office buildings, but it was completely hopeless. Millions of college-educated adults couldn't get one of those jobs. The Great Recession was now entering its 3rd decade, and unemployment was still at a record high. Even the fast food joints in my neighborhood had a two-year waiting list for job applicants. So I remained stuck at school. I felt like a kid standing in the world's greatest video arcade without any quarters, unable to do anything but walk around and watch the other kids play. Level 5. After lunch, I headed to my favorite class, Advanced Oasis Studies. This was a senior year elective where you learned about the history of the Oasis and its creators. Talk about it in Easy A. For the past 5 years, I devoted all of my free time to learning as much as I possibly could about James Holiday. I exhaustively studied his life, accomplishments, and interests. Over a dozen different Holiday biographies had been published in the years since his death, and I had read them all. Several documentary films had also been made about him, and I studied those too. I studied every word Holiday had ever written, and I had played every video game he'd ever made. I took notes, writing down every detail I thought might be related to the hunt. I kept everything in a notebook, which I started to call my Grail Diary after watching the 3rd Indiana Jones film. The more I'd learned about Holiday's life, the more I'd grown to idolize him. He was a god among geeks, a nerd uber deity on the level of Gygax, Garriott, and Gates. He left home after high school with nothing but his wits and his imagination, and he used them to attain worldwide fame and amass a vast fortune. He created an entirely new reality that now provided an escape for most humanity. And to top it all off, he turned his last will and testament into the greatest video game contest of all time. I spent most of my time in Advanced Oasis Studies class annoying our teacher, Mr. Siders, by pointing out errors in our textbook and raising my hand to interject some relevant bit of holiday trivia that I alone thought was interesting. After the first few weeks of class, Mr. Siders had stopped calling on me unless no one else knew the answer to his question. Today he was reading excerpts from The Eggman, a best-selling holiday biography that I had already read 4 times. During his lecture, I kept having to resist the urge to interrupt him and point out all of the really important details the book left out. Instead, I just made a mental note of each omission, and as Mr. Siders began to recount the circumstances of Holliday's childhood, I once again tried to glean whatever secrets I could from the strange way Holliday had lived his life, and from the odd clues about himself he'd chosen to leave behind. James Donovan Holliday was born June 12, 1972 in Middletown, Ohio. He was an only child. His father was an alcoholic, machine operator, and his mother was a bipolar waitress. By all accounts, James was a bright boy, but socially inept. He had an extremely difficult time communicating with the people around him. Despite his obvious intelligence, he did poorly in school because most of his attention was focused on computers, comic books, sci-fi and fantasy novels, movies, and above all else, video games. One day in junior high, Holliday was sitting alone in the cafeteria reading a Dungeons & Dragons player handbook. The game fascinated him, but he never actually played it because he never had any friends to play it with. A boy in his class named Ogden Morrow noticed what Holliday was reading and invited him to attend one of the weekly D&D gaming sessions held at his house. There, in Morrow's basement, Holliday was introduced to an entire group of mega geeks, just like himself. They immediately accepted him as one of their own, and for the first time in his life, James Holliday had a circle of friends. Ogden Morrow eventually became Holliday's business partner, collaborator, and best friend. Many would liken the pairing of Morrow and Holliday to that of Jobs and Wozniak, or Lennon and McCartney. It was a partnership destined to alter the course of human history. At age 15, Holliday created his first video game, Anorak's Quest. He programmed it in BASIC on a TRS-80 color computer he'd received the previous Christmas, though he'd asked his parents for a slightly more expensive Commodore 64. Anorak's Quest was an adventure game set in Synthonia, the fantasy world Holliday had created for his high school Dungeons & Dragons campaign. Anorak was a nickname Holliday had been given by a female British exchange student at his high school. He liked the name Anorak so much that he'd use it for his favorite D&D character, the powerful wizard who later appeared in many of his video games. Holliday created Anorak's Quest for fun to share with the guys in his D&D gaming group. They all found the game addictive and lost countless hours attempting to solve his intricate riddles and puzzles. Ogden Morrow convinced Holliday that Anorak's Quest was better than most of the computer games currently on the market and encouraged him to try selling it. He helped Holliday create some simple cover artwork for the game, and together the two of them hand-copied Anorak's Quest onto dozens of 5¼ inch floppy disks and stuck them into Ziploc bags along with a single photocopy sheet of instructions. They began selling the game on the software rack at their local computer store. Before long, they couldn't make copies fast enough to meet the demand. Morrow and Holliday decided to start their own video game company, Gregarious Games, which initially operated out of Morrow's basement. Holliday programmed new versions of Anorak's Quest for the Atari 800 XL, Apple II, and Commodore 64 computers, and Morrow began placing ads for the game in the back of several computer magazines. Within 6 months, Anorak's Quest became a national bestseller. Holliday and Morrow almost didn't graduate from high school because they spent most of their senior year working on Anorak's Quest 2. And instead of going off to college, they both focused all their energy on their new company, which had grown too large for Morrow's basement. In 1990, Gregarious Games moved into its first real office located in a rundown strip mall in Columbus, Ohio. Over the next decade, a small company took the video game industry by storm, releasing a series of best-selling action and adventure games, all using a groundbreaking first-person graphics engine created by Holliday. Gregarious Games set a new standard for immersive gaming, and every time they released a new title, it pushed the envelope of what seemed possible on the computer hardware available at the time. The rotund Ogden Morrow was naturally charismatic and he handled all the company's business affairs and public relations. At every gregarious games press conference, Morrow grinned infectiously from behind his unruly beard and wire-rimmed spectacles, using his natural gift for hype and hyperbole. Halliday seemed to be Morrow's polar opposite in every way. He was tall, gaunt, and painfully shy, and he preferred to stay out of the limelight. People employed by Gregarious Games during this period say that Halliday frequently locked himself in his office, where he programmed incessantly, often going without food, sleep, or human contact for days or even weeks. On the few occasions that Halliday agreed to do interviews, his behavior became off as bizarre, even by game designer standards. He was hyperkinetic, aloof, and so socially inept that the interviewers often came away with the impression that he was mentally ill. Halliday tended to speak so rapidly that his words were often unintelligible, and he had a disturbing, high-pitched laugh. Even worse so because he was usually the only one who knew what he was laughing about. Sound like the Joker a little bit. When Halliday got bored during an interview or conversation, he would usually get up and walk out without saying a word. Halliday had many well-known obsessions. Chief among them were classic video games, sci-fi and fantasy novels, and movies of all genres. He also had an extreme fixation on the 1980s, the decade during which he'd been a teenager. Halliday seemed to expect everyone around him to share his obsessions, and he often lashed out at those who didn't. He was known to fire longtime employees for not recognizing an obscure line of movie dialogue he quoted, or if he discovered they weren't familiar with one of his favorite cartoon, comic books, or video games. Dr. Morrow would always hire the employee back, usually without Halliday ever noticing. As the years went on, Halliday's already stunted social skills seemed to deteriorate even further. Several exhaustive psychological studies were done on Halliday following his death, and his obsessive adherence to routine and preoccupation with a few obscure areas of interest led many psychologists to conclude that Halliday had suffered from Asperger's syndrome or some other form of high-functioning autism. Despite his eccentricities, no one ever questioned Halliday's genius. The games he created were addictive and wildly popular. By the end of the 20th century, Halliday was widely recognized as the greatest video game designer of his generation, and some would argue of all time. Ogden Morrow was a brilliant programmer in his own right, but his true talent was his knack for business. In addition to collaborating on the company's games, he masterminded all of their early marketing campaigns and shareware distribution schemes, with astounding results. When Gregarious Games finally went public, their stock immediately shot into the stratosphere. By their 30th birthdays, Halliday and Morrow were both multimillionaires. They purchased mansions on the same street. Morrow bought a Lamborghini, took several long vacations, and traveled the world. Halliday bought and restored one of the original DeLoreans used in the Back to the Future films, continued to spend nearly all his time welded to a computer keyboard, and used his newfound wealth to amass what would eventually become the world's largest private collection of classic video games, Star Wars action figures, vintage lunchboxes, and comic books. At the height of its success, Gregarious Games appeared to fall dormant. Several years elapsed during which they released no new games. Morrow made cryptic announcements saying the company was working on an ambitious project that would move them in an entirely new direction. Rumors began to circulate that Gregarious Games was developing some sort of new computer gaming hardware, and that this secret project was rapidly exhausting the company's considerable financial resources. There were also indications that both Halliday and Morrow had invested most of their own personal fortunes in the company's new endeavor. Word began to spread that Gregarious Games was in danger of going bankrupt. Then, in December of 2012, Gregarious Games rebranded itself as Gregarious Simulation Systems, and under this new banner they launched their flagship product, the only product GSS would ever release, the Oasis. The ontology anthropocentric sensory immersive simulation. I hope I don't have to say that again. The Oasis would ultimately change the way people around the world lived, worked, and communicated. It would transform entertainment, social networking, and even global politics. Even though it was initially marketed as a new kind of massively multiplayer online game, the Oasis quickly evolved into a new way of life. In the days before the Oasis, massively multiplayer online games were MMOs, were among the first shared synthetic environments. They allowed thousands of players to simultaneously coexist inside a simulated world, which they connected to via internet. The overall size of these environments was relatively small, usually just a single world or a dozen or so small planets. MMO players could only see these online environments through a small two-dimensional window, their desktop computer monitor, and they could only interact with it using keyboards, mice, and other crude input devices. Gregarious simulation systems elevated the MMO concept to an entirely new level. The Oasis didn't limit its users to just one planet, or even a dozen. The Oasis contained hundreds and eventually thousands of high-resolution 3D worlds for people to explore, and each one was beautifully rendered in meticulous graphic detail, right down to bugs and blades of grass, wind, and weather patterns. Users could circumnavigate each of these planets and never see the same terrain twice. Even in its first primitive incarnation, the scope of the simulation was staggering. Holiday and Morrow referred to the Oasis as an open-source reality, a malleable online universe that anyone could access by way of the internet, using their existing home computer or video game console. You could log in and instantly escape the drudgery of your day-to-day life. You could create an entirely new persona for yourself, with the complete control over how you looked and sounded to others. In the Oasis, the fat could become thin, the ugly could become beautiful, and the shy extroverted, or vice versa. You could change your name, age, sex, race, height, weight, voice, hair color, and bone structure, or you could cease being human altogether and become an elf, ogre, alien, or any other creature from literature, movies, or mythology. In the Oasis, you could become whomever and whatever you wanted to be, without ever revealing your true identity, because your anonymity was guaranteed. Users could also alter the content of virtual worlds inside the Oasis, or create entirely new ones. A person's online presence was no longer limited to a website or a social networking profile. In the Oasis, you could create your own private planet, build a virtual mansion on it, furnish and decorate it however you liked, and invite a few thousand friends over for a party. And those friends could be in a dozen different time zones, spread all over the globe. The keys to the success of the Oasis were the two new pieces of interface hardware that GSS had created, both of which were required to access the simulation: the Oasis visor and haptic gloves. The wireless one-size-fits-all Oasis visor was slightly larger than a pair of sunglasses. It used harmless, low-powered lasers to draw the stunningly real environment of the Oasis right onto its wearers' retinas, completely immersing their entire field of vision in the online world. The visor was light years ahead of the clunky virtual reality goggles available prior to that time, and it represented a paradigm shift in virtual reality technology, as did the lightweight Oasis haptic gloves, which allowed users to directly control the hands of their avatar and interact with their simulated environment as if they were actually inside it. When you picked up objects, opened doors, or operated vehicles, the haptic gloves made you feel those non-existent objects and surfaces as if they were really right there in front of you. The gloves let you, as the television ad puts it, reach in and touch the Oasis. Working together with the visor and the gloves made entering the Oasis an experience unlike anything else available. And once people got a taste of it, there was no going back. The software that powered the simulation, Holiday's new Oasis Reality Engine, also represented a huge technological breakthrough. It managed to overcome limitations that had plagued previous simulated realities. In addition to restricting the overall size of their virtual environments, earlier MMOs had been forced to limit their virtual populations, usually to a few thousand users per server. If too many people were logged in at the same time, the simulation was slow to a crawl, and avatars would freeze in mid-stride as the system struggled to keep up. But the Oasis utilized a new kind of fault-tolerant server array that could draw additional processing power from every computer connected to it. At the time of its initial launch, the Oasis could handle up to 5 million simultaneous users with no discernible latency and no chance of a system crash. The massive marketing campaign promoted the launch of the Oasis. The pervasive television billboard and internet ads featured a lush green oasis complete with palm trees and a pool of crystal blue water surrounded on all sides by a vast barren desert. GSS's new endeavor was a massive success from day one. The Oasis was what people had been dreaming of for decades. The virtual reality they had been promised for so long was finally here, and it was even better than they'd imagined. The Oasis was an online utopia, a holodeck for the home, and its biggest selling point, it was free. Most online games of the day generated revenue by charging users a monthly subscription fee for access. GSS only charged a one-time sign-up fee of 25 cents, for which you received a lifetime Oasis account. The ads all used the same tagline, the Oasis. It's the greatest video game ever created, and it only cost a quarter. At the time of drastic social and cultural upheaval, when most of the world's population longed for an escape from reality, the Oasis provided it in a form that was cheap, legal, safe, and not medically proven to be addictive. The ongoing energy crisis contributed greatly to the Oasis's runaway popularity. The skyrocketing costs of oil made airline and automobile travel too expensive for the average citizen, and the Oasis became the only getaway most people could afford. As the era of cheap, abundant energy drew to a close, poverty and unrest began to spread like a virus. Every day, more and more people had reason to seek solace inside Holiday and Marl's virtual utopia. Any business that wanted to set up shop inside the Oasis had to rent or purchase virtual real estate, which Morrow dubbed surreal estate, from GSS. Anticipating this, the company has set aside Sector 1 as a simulation's designated business zone and began to sell and rent millions of blocks of surreal estate there. City-sized shopping malls were erected in the blink of an eye, and storefronts spread across planets like time-lapse footage of mold devouring an orange. Urban development had never been so easy. In addition to the billions of dollars that GSS raked in selling land that didn't actually exist, they made a killing selling virtual objects and vehicles. The Oasis became such an integral part of people's day-to-day social lives that users were more than willing to shell out real money to buy accessories for their avatars: clothing, furniture, houses, flying cars, magic swords, and machine guns. These items were nothing but ones and zeros stored in the Oasis servers, but they were also status symbols. Most items only cost a few credits, but since they cost nothing for GSS to manufacture, it was all profit. Even in the throes of an ongoing economic recession, the Oasis allowed Americans to continue engaging in their favorite pastime, shopping. The Oasis quickly became the single most popular used for the internet, and so much so that terms Oasis and internet gradually became synonymous. In the incredibly easy to use three-dimensional Oasis operating system, which GSS gave away for free, became the single most popular computer operating system in the world. Before long, billions of people around the world were working and playing in the Oasis every day. Some of them met, fell in love, and got married without ever setting foot on the same continent. The lines of distinction between a person's real identity and that of the avatar began to blur. It was the dawn of the new era, one where most of the human race now spend all of their free time inside a video game. I'm going to stop here. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Those levels. We're on 6 now, so when we come back, I'll be reading level 6, and we'll see where the story takes us from there. Until next time, I'm your host, Piscean Lore. Feel free to enjoy the rest of the game clips. We got about a minute left. So enjoy the rest of the game clips and join me for the next levels, you know. And I'll see you in the next video. You guys have a good night. Peace.
Please don't screw this up.